of your team or members of your network to watch the video and the recording, you can certainly refer back to the LinkedIn website and find that recording in the next couple of days. So let me go ahead and present here. So most of you are here, I think, because you're either extremely interested in AI and tech and in supply chain, or you're members of ASCM, or you're thinking about becoming a member of ASCM, or both, or all. And I would really like to invite all of you, if you're here today because of an interest in technology and AI and supply chain, we are hosting an upcoming event on April 8th that starts at 7:45 a.m. We will be kicking off the agenda. Breakfast will be served by 7:15 a.m. at the Minnesota Valley Country Club, April 8th, with a half day that is going to entirely focus on AI and technology and supply chain. And you will walk away from Summit with an understanding of how you can actually use tools that are real-time available to you. So there will be 2 training sessions on how to use tools that are available in the market today to make your lives easier, better, to make your work easier, better, whatever that case may be. We will also have presenters on a couple of different types of technology and presenters that will talk about how their company actually used AI, ChatGPT, to rebuild some very common and generally very expensive technologies that are available on the market today or already being leveraged. So if you would like to come and get a good understanding of the language, of the terminology and how it's evolving, and then actually get some training on how to use these tools in supply chain applications, I highly, highly recommend that you join us for Summit. I would also recommend, this is our website, twincities.ascm.org. Check out the website. You can go to the events tab and find a list of all of the different events and the training and certifications that we have available. Additionally, we do a lot of communication via our LinkedIn site. So not necessarily the group. There is a LinkedIn group. The LinkedIn site is where we're really active around what events we have pending and information about certifications and other educations that are available. We as the chapter are really passionate about making sure that we're developing a local community of practitioners and offering networking opportunities and educational opportunities. So every month we are attempting to have either a happy hour, a webinar, or a plant tour with a local manufacturer. So please keep an eye on the LinkedIn site. And we do send information in emails, although heavens knows if that makes through on any given email surge. But visit our LinkedIn page to find more information. Okay, I am Emily Levasseur. I am the current president of the ASCM Twin Cities chapter. I also, stop sharing here. You don't have to see my kiddo. I also have the pleasure today of introducing our presenter for this particular webinar. And you can see him right now. Richard Lebovitz is founder and chief strategy officer of Lean DNA, who is going to be speaking to us today about how we can start to expect to see and how we can use AI and technology applications in supply chain. Richard has enjoyed a deep career in manufacturing and technology, and prior to founding Lean DNA, he was founder and CEO of an Austin-based company called Factory Logic, which was eventually acquired by SAP in 2016. His work today focuses on helping organizations apply lean thinking and modern AI systems to improve their decision-making, operational visibility, and just for supply chain execution purposes in general. He's led lean conversion projects in 15 countries. Wow. That converted traditional enterprises to lean manufacturing. He's also a board member of the Association for Manufacturing Excellence. He's mentioned he's done some collaborative activities with different supply chain groups, including ISM, boo, but that's okay. We'll forgive him for that. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Richard for the rest of the presentation, and we will have a little Q&A session once Richard gets through his content. So with that, Richard, by all means, take it away.
Great. Well, Emily, thank you. And obviously, I'm excited to be here. You know, a long history in the space. And when we start thinking about AI and some of the capabilities, it's an exciting topic. What I would say in terms of the presentation, we do want to not talk about the abstract terms. I really want to focus the presentation and what we're going to talk about today on how you can actually apply AI to supply chain teams and execute better and make better decisions in general. First, I do want to provide a little bit of background on Lean DNA and our Apex platform, just so you understand kind of what we do and where we fit. But our platform is a AI-driven platform that's really purpose-built for manufacturing, and it's meant to help supply chain teams, reduce excess inventory while also improving on-time delivery. And I like to say, hopefully, give people their weekends back in terms of improving efficiency. We are deployed in about 30 countries, and that also required us to integrate to about 40 plus ERP systems. And I think where that's relevant is when you start talking about technology and AI, it's really given us a unique perspective across different technologies, different cultures. As this is becoming a technology that people are deploying faster and faster, we really have a good perspective on what works, how do you go about it, and hopefully through the presentation today, I'm going to be able to share some of that with you. And as Emily mentioned, I'll leave some time at the end for some Q&A, as you guys have questions. So now I just wanted to start with a quick overview of what's happening across the industry. And our team and a few of our members are actually on the call here today. We actually conducted a pretty broad research study across about 250 manufacturing leaders. And some of the highlights found that I think are important are first, about 92% of executives said that AI-driven insights are essential for predicting and preventing disruption. So people believe that it's helpful. But at the same time, only about 19% of the companies that we surveyed have successfully digitized their manufacturing and supply chain operations. So it's kind of interesting to see the tension of what's happening. From what we see, leaders know AI matters, but many organizations are still struggling to implement AI and make it work. What's the roadmap? How do we get a good ROI out of it? So it's still a challenge. So the question is why AI, why now? And as Emily mentioned, I've been in technology for probably the last 35 years. I've started 3 technology companies in the manufacturing supply chain sector. My previous company was acquired by SAP back in probably about 20 years ago. Then I started Lean DNA, and we are kind of one of the leaders now in terms of applying AI-driven technology around supply chain operations and execution. How do we optimize it too? So one question we get a lot is what's driving the rapid growth in AI? And for me, what I've seen is it's really the perfect combination of technology, data availability, and really the business needs to drive improvement. So first, there has been some exciting breakthroughs in the technology. Things like many of you are probably using this every day, LLMs that understand supply chain language and context. So it's not just that those existed, let's say 2 years ago, but now they really understand supply chain. The models can handle very complex scenarios and analytics. They're also the ability now to have pre-trained models on supply chain. And the things that I would say we're most excited about is what's called agentic AI or agents. And I think it's really just begun, and people are talking about it a lot, but it really has just begun. But the potential of it to make our lives easier, to drive better results is pretty dramatic. So that's one area that's been pretty exciting. The second area, which has been probably an evolution over the last 10 years, but it's just data availability. ERPs have gotten more modern, SaaS, cloud-based, can deal with a lot of massive amounts of data that's easy now to access, and it can store those transactions. And then you combine that with better sensor technologies in the factory floor, the way in which we collaborate with suppliers now and with other team members has gotten, easier as well. And the ability to kind of start to not only gather that data, but to be able to log it historically so we can actually use it to train the models has just become a lot more cost effective over the last several years. It just didn't exist, 5 or 10 years ago. And the reality is, when you think about AI, a lot of these models actually existed 25, 30 plus years ago, the analytics behind it, but the combination of many factors and obviously the evolution of the LLMs has made it where it's such a powerful technology these days. The third is just competitive pressure. It's really no longer about let's use AI to get ahead. I think that was the case maybe even just a year or two ago. Now it's more about if you're not leveraging AI, you're going to be falling behind. So these are the things that I think are driving a lot of the excitement right now. Now I want to take just a moment to translate some of the key concepts, that you hear every day into what it means from a supply chain leadership and teams perspective. So a lot of what you've probably heard, which is really what started, was artificial intelligence. And that's just the ability to build smart machines that can perform tasks that can mimic or augment human behavior, and also support what we're trying to do with a lot more human intelligence. So that was kind of the first thing people started to really hear about. Then the large language models, or LLMs, evolved, which really kind of started out initially as just an intelligent chatbot that can, but more importantly, at least in the supply chain world today, those chatbots now can understand things like order policy optimization, which I'll talk more about in the presentation, demand analytics. It really understands everything about procurement technology, which made it very easy just to answer kind of basic questions. Machine learning is where now you started to really build more advanced analytics that can learn from historical data and patterns, and then using that to predict future behavior or future results around shortages, predicting optimized inventory levels, which I'll show here in a little bit, identifying demand patterns where you can't really write a heuristic algorithm to go do it, but you can learn from patterns and use a combination of the two. So that was kind of the next evolution. Then more recently, you started hearing about generative AI, and that started to appear as like the AI assistants, and those can now go from just chatting, where they can draft supplier emails, create better procurement reports that can integrate with your Excel files, generate policy documentation or standard work, which is obviously a big part of, especially in the world of lean manufacturing supply chain, a big part of what we try to do. And then finally is agentic AI, which again, I mentioned I'm most excited about, which I think is just now becoming a really hot topic, but it's ultimately going to be, or it's going to take the analytics and the workflow and the ability to interact with individuals as well as teams to drive towards specific outcomes. And I think that's the important thing, where everybody wants to get to a goal like reducing my inventory while improving my delivery, and I want to do it in 4 days versus 7 days in a week. But that is not always clearly defined. And so agentic AI is where you can have general workflow with data, but now the AI and the agents can start to help you drive to certain results that aren't always clear. There's a lot of ambiguity towards it. So a lot of excitement there. So as you start to use these technologies and they start to expand, there was another data point that came from the research that I mentioned we conducted earlier. And that was that about 76% of manufacturing executives say they don't have predictive view of supply and demand. And you can see the impact across different roles of not having that visibility or those analytics in place. For example, planners, they spend an enormous amount of time cleaning data in order to set the right procurement policies. Buyers are going to spend an enormous amount of time sifting through hundreds, sometimes thousands of POs to prioritize what impacts on-time delivery, which is what they primarily worry about. But then at the same time, they're being held accountable to manage inventory. So we want to have the lowest inventory, highest on-time delivery. And I'm sure many of you here living in supply chain know that we tend to be that last point before we got to deliver. So if engineering's late, there's quality issues, demand shifting, all these things are happening, but it always tends to show up in supply chain, and you guys are having to deal with it. The other is managers rely on a lot of manual what-if analysis, and really what they want is not, that's good to support what-if analysis and scenario planning, but what they really want is the ability to very quickly get to the optimal plan. How do we then go execute it? And that's some of what I'll talk about here throughout the presentation. And then finally, executives often see problems after they've already occurred. And what they want is a more predictive view that can be more proactive, that can prescribe exactly what actions to take, track that, learn from it, and then start to close the gap. And that's partly by analyzing operational data, identifying patterns much earlier, which brings us to an important shift that we're starting to see happen right now. And that's the fact that, AI is used to be viewed as, or traditionally was viewed as a experimental technology. But today it's becoming table stakes for really any operational decision support. And I can't see everybody here, but if I probably was in a room and asked everybody to raise their hand who's using AI to some degree, I think all of you would say yes to some degree. I think the vast majority of you. And so as we see organizations adopt AI effectively, some of the gains that we're seeing are examples like early risk detection, for supplier risk or potential shortages. Not just are you short or running some basic analytics through a line of balance, could you be short, but it's actually doing a lot of risk assessment based on supplier delivery, the type of parts, the impact on production readiness to then prioritize that risk. Second would be things like faster and more automated inventory actions. And then the combination of that around risk and actions, how do we improve and create better collaboration and alignment across teams to get them focused on those things that really matter and things that matter but we can't impact? How do we now easily escalate that to the right department? As organizations have started to adopt, they've seen big success. But those that don't adopt, as I mentioned earlier, are quickly falling behind. So the key question becomes, what role should AI actually play in supply chain execution? There are a few misconceptions that I've heard, and I'm sure many of you hear, that are especially important when you talk about applying AI to supply chain and manufacturing operations. And I'll just kind of go through three that I think are pretty common that we hear a lot about. And the first myth that we hear is AI will replace supply chain professionals. And you hear that a lot about replacing people. And it's interesting in manufacturing because we actually have a unique experience, because when robotics and automation took place, going back even 30, 40, 50 years ago, when things started to get automated, everybody's worried about the guy that drilled the hole. Now that we automated, what is he going to do? And clearly we know from manufacturing that they shifted, not get rid of people, but the new jobs were created. There were actually higher value added jobs. So the key thing about replacing is we don't see that happening, but jobs will 100% change, the type of jobs. But those that are really embracing it, leveraging it from the strategy perspective, can shift that to much higher value added jobs that can ultimately free up buyers and planners to basically do things that we could never get to before. Like maybe you wanted to spend a lot more time working with your suppliers to improve performance. Now that becomes very difficult. Second myth is we need perfect data before we start implementing AI. And it's actually quite the opposite. AI can work with your existing data, but more importantly, AI can be used to help clean up your data, to identify issues with your data. And to me, creating good quality data is not a one-time goal, right? And we hear people do that. Let's clean up our data, then we're going to implement these advanced analytics. And you really have to view cleaning up your data as a journey, that you start with an understanding of where you are and you're just going to get better over time. So not only is it not correct about waiting to get AI clean, you need to be using AI, and you can use AI to actually clean up your data, which now is really critical for these analytics. The third one is AI requires massive upfront investment. Not true. You can actually not only implement AI very gradually, but it's actually the best way to do that. I think where we've seen companies make mistakes, and even companies like ourselves, when we've done things in different ways, trying to do too much too quick can actually lead to slower results, and it can be harder to drive change management. So pick an area that's really high value add, start there, move fast. And now when I say move fast, things should be taking days to week, not months to years anymore. So you can move very quickly with this technology, but focus on results, focus on something small, prove it out, and then go on to the next thing. But you don't have to start big, and it doesn't need to be very expensive, but you do want to pick things where there's very targeted use cases that you think you can impact very quickly. Now, as we get into AI, we're obviously very excited about, but we are seeing sometimes what were initially challenges, but what are these improvements that we've seen with our customers? We've kind of learned over time, what are the things you really want to be thinking about from a AI readiness checklist that's really important to not only implement AI, but actually see it being adopted. And so as you build a process to link AI implementation with real business results, here's kind of some suggestions that you want to think about as you're starting to implement. The first is like data and systems, right? So one thing that's good about ERP is it can do a lot, but you do want to start looking at, do we actually track history, and do we have transactional data that we can use. Some good examples would be data, things like supplier performance, demand history versus forecast. How's that varying? The ability to then extract that data, like we have tools that we call Lean DNA Connect and different APIs, but you want to be able to not only have the data, but being able to extract it in some way so you can start to build out some of these AI platforms. So that's the first thing. Make sure you got the data. Second is people and culture. Do you have a leadership team that's supportive of it? I would say 2 years ago, that was always a question. I would be surprised now that there is not some area of your company, even at the IT level, that has a very specific strategy on how do we use AI. So it's a lot easier now, but it was a big challenge. But you just want to make sure that exists. And if it doesn't exist within your team or your sphere of who you know, I guarantee it exists somewhere in your company, and you just have to spend some time to go identify those leadership to get that type of support. Make sure teams are open to it, identify champions, and again, the willingness to start small and iterate, and that's important. Third thing is just business case, and that's probably where we've seen some mistakes with other companies. At Lean DNA and our Apex platform, I'll talk a lot about here shortly, we're very focused on use cases and how those link to business results, mainly around like inventory, shortages, kind of efficiency, improved collaboration, but there's got to be some business case you're driving to, or you're going to have challenges. And making sure that those metrics that you're driving to actually have some sort of disruptive improvement goal. I think, to me, kind of the goal with Lean is really driving big goals and big changes, drives big changes in behavior and gets big results. If you're trying to do things incrementally, 5% here, 2% there, it's great, but the capability of AI and the ability to really drive change means you got to have big, aggressive goals, and AI can help you get there. And then make sure there's people budgeted to start with a pilot project. The fourth thing is just technical readiness. Does your IT team support some sort of data integration? You can start simple with extracts, you get more advanced, but you at least need the support for it. Make sure you have cloud infrastructure and willingness to adopt that. Basic data governance, security. Definitely, we deal with defense contractors, a lot of companies, and you got to be really disciplined about that. The good thing is most companies now have ways to get that in place or have already done it because of how fast it's evolved over the last couple of years, but you just want to make sure that that's in place and there's protocols for how you share data. So this is a key checklist that we've seen over time that you just want to make sure you got those key elements in place. So now I want to kind of shift from kind of a little bit of where we are with AI and some of the challenges and the checklist to move forward. And I want to talk about some practical examples of how AI is actually used for execution. There are two components of Lean DNA Apex, and I know I want to talk about this just in general. I won't spend a lot of time on our platform, but it's a good example of an area where we talk a lot about, which is how do we use AI to help improve optimization and workflow execution, which I think is really the core to what a lot of you are probably doing in the supply chain area. Execution would consist of key workflows such as like clear to build is what we call it, or clear to commit, which is predicting out shortages to build certain products. Line of balance, how do you prioritize inventory actions, two-way integration with your ERP system. That kind of all falls in the bucket of what we call workflow execution. The other bucket where you really start to see AI getting highly leveraged and there's a lot of opportunity is using it for optimization capabilities to further improve the ability to optimize inventory, to improve on-time delivery. Our inventory optimization capability leverages AI to help continually improve things like order policies and the strategies around that. So if you're executing to the most efficient and resilient plans, you can really drive dramatic results. The important thing I want to mention here is kind of the third component of this loop, which is what we call the learning loop. And that's where you optimize as best you can, setting the right target policies based on PFEP, what's the right safety stock, what's the right kind of min-max level, things like that. Then you want to execute. Now I'm going to drive data to execution. I'm going to be potentially driving actions. POs I can cancel, split, maybe push out, pull in. Learning from supplier deliveries, my lead time in SAP is 100 days, but they're actually delivering in 105 days, or learning around their supplier delivery performance. So you learn a lot from execution, and then you could feed that back to optimization. So the learning loop is to optimize, execute, track that data, learn from execution, and then feed that back and do a better job optimization. And that's where we think the future is not just kind of more of these silos and not just, hey, let's build an optimization platform, but it's combining those two worlds of optimization and execution and then tracking, so you create this kind of learning loop which can drive dramatic results. So in terms of results, I want to take a few minutes to just look at a few real examples. Surtech Medical, which is actually a local Minneapolis manufacturer, was one of our customers dealing with a lot of unreliable inventory data. They had misaligned supply and demand, challenges with forecasting. So by improving visibility and generating more intelligent actions, they were able to reduce inventory by 20% while also improving on-time delivery. And you'll hear that from me over and over on this call, or even when I talk to our customers or speak at any other conferences. People think that to go improve delivery, I need more inventory, or if I've got a lot of excess inventory, if I have inventory and I start to reduce it, I can impact delivery. And the reality is that, and we've shown this over and over again, is that if you optimize and you set inventory to the right levels, you can actually get both. So it's not about reducing inventory, it's around right sizing inventory so you can actually achieve better on-time delivery with actually lower inventory and a lot less chaos in terms of how you interact with your suppliers and across your teams. So the key takeaway is better decision support at Surtech allow them to right-size inventory without sacrificing service. Johnson Controls, we're in probably about 30 to 40 of their sites, is another great example of how AI and the connected supply chain can reduce the manual and reactive work that many teams experience every day. So before improving their execution visibility, their teams were spending an enormous amount of time manually chasing supplier commits, updating ERP records, and they were trying to manage thousands of supplier signals across things like spreadsheets, emails, different systems, many of which I'm sure you guys deal with today. So the challenge was that the data was fragmented and it was too difficult to quickly analyze in order to guide, prioritize decisions, not just messages, right? There's a lot of messages that come from your ERP, but prioritize messages that are ranked based on risk, based on value that they can then go act upon. So by applying intelligent analytics to supplier commitments and material readiness scoring, the system could continuously evaluate which shortages actually pose the greatest risk to production. So instead of buyers reviewing hundreds of POs, trying to decide what mattered most, the system prioritized the issues that had the biggest impact on the business. And that shift had a measurable impact. So as you can see here, some key results were over 700,000 manual ERP updates eliminated manually. About 13 hours of staff time saved per site each week. So not only do we achieve an improvement on shortages and inventory, with the 27% reduction in shortages and reduced inventory, but we actually took less time from the team. But of all that, I would say the most important takeaway is not just efficiency. It's that AI helped their team shift from, chasing suppliers, chasing other team members to being much more proactive around supply chain optimization and execution. And that's when AI starts to improve the execution, not just in supply chain, but across the entire organization as a whole. So when manufacturers start to connect supply chain data and apply an intelligent analysis, they move from reacting to problems to systematically prioritizing the actions that matter most. So I want to just take a quick moment to give you a preview of how this works in practice. This slide is just an overview of how our platform by LeanDNA works, and it enables the supply chain planning and execution that's driven by kind of this AI and different analytics. The core idea here is actually very simple, though. First, as I mentioned earlier, we integrate with ERP systems and operational systems to ensure accurate and timely data. So that's the first thing we have to do, and make sure there's good quality around that. And like I said, quality doesn't mean you connect and you run it. It means you've got tools and processes in place to connect, analyze the data, and then start to create quality that's ultimately then going to feed these other analytics. So once that's in place, we then translate that data using deep domain knowledge and advanced analytics, which then provides insights that identify things like risk, shortages, inventory opportunities. And then those insights are used to create actions prioritized by business impact. And those actions are then given to buyers, planners, and other members of the supply chain teams in ways that make sense to them, right? They may be common issues, but a buyer may have an action like, you need to cancel this PO, but the analyst may be given an action, you need to lower the safety stock from 100 to 10, right? So there's different types of actions, but the key is to prioritize those, understand who needs to know, make sure they get done, and then track the results over time. And if you do that, you're going to get, things like improved working capital, reduced shortages, and then overall team efficiency. And one great example of AI in action with our platform is our AI system, which we call K. And just real quickly, K, Abe, I started with my career with a Japanese firm called Management Technology Japan. And the individual who trained me 30 years ago was an individual named K Abe. And he worked with Shigeo Shingo, came from Toyota. He was 30 years my senior. So obviously since then has retired many, many years ago. But when we started building out some of our AI tools, to really give some recognition for K and also reflect the fact that K is not just about a chatbot, it's really a trained AI assistant, your kind of co-pilot that's going to help you optimize your supply chain. We thought it was a great, recognition of K over many, many years of what he did for me and what ultimately led to, Lean In and what we've built. And this is just a quick example of K. And as I mentioned, everybody uses chatbot these days, but what's unique about K is that it's trained on our data and ultimately your data. It understands things like plan for every part analysis, not only what that means, but how do you size different min-max order policy? When do you use one versus the other? What's your ABC XYZ demand profile? These are very technical terms that people that do that type of work understand it, but a lot of people don't. And so K now gives you the ability to not only understand it, but understand questions and help answer it. Things like clear to build. So, this is an example here of just a simple question I asked, which is, what are the top 10 items that are having the most critical impact on CTV? And you'll notice that I didn't even say clear to build. K understands that CTV is clear to build. And what does that mean around shortage prioritization? And then here's another example where we're using this question to really ask a question like, who are your suppliers that are causing the biggest impact on shortages and excess inventory? And you can see that it's not very high level, it's very specific. Here's your 3 suppliers. This supplier has the highest impact on your clear to build impacted orders. This one has the highest clear to build impacted shortage value. Here's the total shortage occurrences over time. And so it kind of highlights the fact that it's not only running the analytics, but it's looking at performance over time. And then it's using that to actually correlate information that if somebody was to do it manually, one is, could you even get the data and even analyze the data? Or if you get it, it would be 10 to 15 different spreadsheets that you're trying to pull it together. So what we've done is taken the ability to connect all these different systems, train it on a lot of supply chain optimization, methodology, workflows, the roles of different personas, what's the different objectives, and then make it very easy for people to kind of collaborate with the system. So super excited about the potential of that. And the last thing is I did want to drive into something a little bit more specific example of how we actually apply it to what we call this optimized execution, which I talked about earlier. And this kind of rolls everything together in terms of some of our newer technology and how we're actually using it. And I'll just walk through kind of a quick little example of our platform. And this is what we call a burn-off chart. And what this is basically doing is when you're running what we call your plan for every part or inventory optimization platform and you run your analytics, it gives you kind of a projection of what is your inventory going to do over time. And so whenever we run kind of our analytics, it's one of the first graphs we'll actually start with. And so as you can see here, the first thing when you hover over it is trying to understand this kind of classification of not only what your inventory is and the opportunity, but how do we classify that inventory into different buckets. And so here you can see when I first look at it, I can understand within the different colors, like that darker blue is where are you above target, which means we analytically calculate what is the target inventory for this specific part based on a plan for every part analysis. And that'll look at things like your safety stock and your, what we call your cycle stock based on your order policy, and we establish analytically what's the right target level for that part. And anything over that target within a certain, within 5%, let's say, we want to now reduce it. And that's going to then drive quick wins. When you're below target, that's where we have too little, which could be potential shortages. And so we need to increase that level to make sure we're going to be at a certain service level in terms of our on-time delivery performance or clear to build performance. And then at the bottom, you'll see kind of that yellow and gray, and that's where we're classifying those parts as either obsolete or slow moving inventory. And so this view kind of breaks up all your data around your inventory, both analytically into a target and how to classify it, but also gives you a health of your inventory. And that dashed green line here at the bottom is kind of what's that ultimate optimal target level. And you'll notice that we're way above that, but it also highlights the fact that in supply chain, a lot of times you'll come in and they've made decisions around strategic buys of inventory, or they way over forecasted last year and you're stepping in trying to deal with it. And sometimes there's not much you can do. We have excess or obsolete, we'll try to burn it off. But sometimes unless you can use cross-site analytics between sites, it can be difficult. But at least it tells you where you are today and more importantly, what can you do, at least going forward, given the current situation. And then that leads to that next slide, which just kind of highlights where we can actually calculate what's the target, and then ultimately, where can I be in the next 52 weeks, even with everything that's happened, all the past scenarios. But let's look at how good we can get and what we can go execute on, and let's go get it. And that's what this helps you kind of identify. Still have obsolete, still have excess, but what can I go get? Let's go get that, and let's drive some level of opportunity. And we typically see anything from a 10 to 30% inventory reduction in that kind of first year is what we would expect to achieve, and we usually can get there. Then you can also see kind of a quick view of what does this mean overall in terms of what are my top suppliers that are my biggest driver of inventory opportunities? But at the same time, what are my suppliers that are the biggest drivers of shortages or clear to build impact? Or maybe I want to look at it by buyer, I want to look at it by item. The other areas we also consider would be things like safety stock and MOQ, but this gives you kind of a quick snapshot of what that looks like. This is kind of a little bit of detail slide. I won't get to this in detail, but once you do all that, our key approach is you then rank all your parts from top to bottom on what part has the biggest inventory potential in the next 52 weeks. We do the same thing for shortages, but in this case, I'm looking at what parts have the biggest inventory impact. That kind of line here that you can see, that dash blue line is my target, and you can see that orange line is like way above my target, and it's going up and coming down, and the purple bars represent POs. And so that gives you kind of an understanding that shows the buyer, the analyst, that, hey, we understand this particular part. And what our engine now is recommending is the green line. It's saying, hey, now if you take these actions, here's how we can get you to that target. And it's very prescriptive on every PO, what action to take. And it also understands safety stock, MOQ, lead times, demand variability. So we set a target that's truly achievable, and then we drive those actions. The other thing that we've done, which I think is really important, is around explainability. And that's trying to understand not only what are the actions that we want the AI to take and it's recommending the buyer to do, but how did you come up with that? And how did you maybe make trade-offs between, splitting a PO to deal with the early delivery, to deal with the shortage, but then I don't need the rest for another 2 months, versus bringing it in early? Or, hey, I'm moving something out 2 weeks. Does that make sense? Or should I wait to move it out unless it's over, let's say, 1 month with a certain value based on the carrying cost of inventory versus the cost to place or split a PO, right? There's cost and trade-offs associated with all of that. And so what we've learned is we need to explain that in an easy way so that individuals can understand not only how we're making those trade-offs and if you want to make adjustments to it, but why the AI made those decisions so people trust it. I think there's a lot of industries where AI can make recommendations around trends and it's very helpful information. But in supply chain, when you're talking about execution, you have to be right. And so the more these tools get implemented, it's really important for people to believe it and trust it. Otherwise, we've learned firsthand that the buyers, planners, analysts won't do it. So explainability is a big part of what we do. And as I mentioned earlier, for every part, Kay is always there in the background analyzing a lot of information. I won't read it all here, but if you read it, you can kind of see the summary of the analysis and what it's recommending and why it did what it did. And you can actually interact with it, ask questions. Can you explain this in more detail? How did you come up with this safety stock level? What were the algorithms that you used? And Kay can explain all of that, which makes the buyer less about, hey, I'm just following those recommendations, but more of a partner that helps understand a lot of data, understands the analytics, and then ultimately can kind of help you make a better job moving forward and following those actions. So just to kind of wrap up, I want to just take a few brief moments to talk about where we see the future. And I know I've covered a lot, but how all this comes together, and then we'll have some time for some maybe some Q&A. So when we think about the future and where machine learning, advanced analytics, intelligent agents start to come together, that first step is to really leverage them for improved optimization and execution and then workflow. And then as the agentic AI, which I mentioned earlier, is very exciting. I think you're going to hear a lot more about it over the next, I think, couple of years. When you can use the agents to guide automated workflow, and the key thing is there's workflow engines that are out there. Those have been around for years, but it's the ability to link workflow with LLMs and these agents that understand data to deal with a lot of the ambiguity and these ambiguous situations where the action is not always totally clear. There may be things we need to deal with, and there may be questions. And so we want to have those agents in place to drive actions that can get you, towards those inventory and delivery targets. We also want to use systems that can learn from success, which I mentioned earlier, but we also want to have our systems learning from failures. And I've actually got an article that's coming out probably in the next few weeks that talks about how you need to be feeding AI your data and your successes, but you need to also be feeding it your failures, because that's how it learns, and it can help you do a better job with the targets, better job with collaborating, and ultimately better job making decisions. So like a simple example we want to get to is, a planner at a site, let's say a tier 1 factory, factory 1, can I get this PO on time to delivery? And then being able to quickly, automatically have it talk to another agent at another site that can now quickly confirm, hey, I'm clear to build to deliver that part on time. So a very simple use case, but it starts with a lot of that foundation of AI and how you kind of move it forward. And just the last thing I just want to say is, as we improve that kind of supplier to factory collaboration, the exciting next step is to expand to a more connected network of factories and suppliers. Keeping in mind, a factory has suppliers, and those suppliers are all factories. And those suppliers, which are factories themselves, have other suppliers. So it's a very much a connected network. And so the goal is to streamline prioritization, communication, and escalation, while at the same time giving people more time to focus on higher value-added activities. And these higher value-adding tasks and activities are the things that you could never just sometimes get to in the past. And what's exciting about AI is that now you can. And I think that's the way we kind of view it. And with that, I will pause for any questions.
Wow.
We've got some time.
Richard, this is so exciting. I was scribbling down all sorts of questions as you were going through this. I did ask the participants to save questions until the end. So what I would suggest, if anyone has questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and or feel free to raise your hand on Teams, and it will take me just a minute to scroll through the list, but I'll go through and find you and call on you, and yeah, you can ask your question. In the meantime, what I would like to say to participants is, if you were following along and you're going, what is an agent? What is a workflow? What is process engineering? What is vibe coding? What is all these things, LLM? Join us at Summit, because one of our presenters will actually be speaking about and educating on what are the definitions of those things, what do they mean, how do you use them. In particular, I admit I still don't know what an agent is exactly, so I'll be interested to learn a lot more at Summit. For you, Richard, a question I have is, going back to the beginning, to one of the first slides you put up around only 19% of companies have digitized their supply chain and manufacturing. What does that mean? What does a successful digitization look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Obviously the ERP systems have done a great job kind of with all the transactional data, but digitization means you start to kind of kill a lot of the manual spreadsheets and start to break things down. And so at least when we think about it, it's how do you get the supply chain information in line around, PO data, actions, demand data, create more online collaboration with suppliers around priorities, around shortages, what's the impact, be able to go directly to those suppliers, communicate online, have that feedback, whether it's I can commit to a PO, or here's a new date. And once you grab that, then feeding that back into your system of record, which is typically the ERP system. So that's one example of digitization. Another example we find a lot is things like what drives a lot of the supply chain efficiency is what we call order policies. And that's typically an analyst that's downloading your data, doing a plan for every part, sizing safety stock. And what we found is that many companies do it at best maybe once a quarter in spreadsheets, maybe once a year, maybe never at all. And making that no longer this kind of offline process, because that drives everything. It sets everything, getting those policies right. But yet it's an offline analytics that probably, maybe 50%, 30% do it on a regular basis. I think very few do it on a more digitized basis, maybe 10%. That's where that number came from. So getting that online now, so you're driving better targets for inventory, better policies, which then drive better actions. That's, again, part of the digitization. So when you start to think about how much do you guys rely upon spreadsheets versus online tools, I think that's probably a good way to think about it. And most people in our world of supply chain optimization execution have tended to find that many of our work is unfortunately a lot of export to Excel or even an offline BI tool. Again, those are great and great at visualization, but they're still offline, sometimes one-way visualization, but they're not feeding back into execution, which I think is really critical. And that optimization execution loop is part of that digitization process.
Yes. Okay. I don't see other questions. So in lieu of that, I'm going to ask another question. I was really drawn to your AI readiness checklist slide. Would you mind pulling that back up just so viewers can reference it? And the reason I was drawn to this is because many of you may not know this, Richard and Lean DNA team, but many of you on the call know that I work for Waypost Advisors, and we do supply chain consulting. And we have, in the last 6 months, had a lot more interest from clients, unsurprisingly, in leveraging AI in their processes that they feel are broken. Now, the challenge that I feel we're up against is I come from a long line of technology implementations that followed a methodology of people, process, data, then technology, right? People are critical roles and responsibilities. They behave in the process, and the process generates the data, and the data supports technology use. And we have a situation right now where we have a client that has multiple facilities that can make the same products. They can share WIP and raw materials between the facilities, and they can all make the same finished goods. And they're finding themselves in a situation right now where They're frequently out of stock, both on WIP and then eventually finished goods, and it's causing their transportation to be significantly suboptimized because they're doing three things basically. They are either having to move out of position inventory, interplant between plants, right? Which is that's just margin erosion right there. They are having to switch from being able to ship in a rail car to ship in trucks, which is very costly, and or they're shipping finished goods from a less cost optimal plant. So from a plant that's further away from their customer location. Their question was, how can we improve our inventory planning so that we're not spending so much on unnecessary transportation? And as we've gotten in and understood their current processes, they do not have, I think you called it CTB or ATP, I've heard it called it in the past, right? Available to promise. They do not have an inventory or order planning process. Their process is look at what orders are on the books for the next week or two, and then figure out what they need throughout the process to support that. And so when you start thinking about that, and so the challenge is they're like, how can we do this better? And we want to use AI to do it. And it's like, but you don't even have the processes in place. You don't have the people to do this work. Like, how do we get from, we have no processes, we do not have roles that own processes that could be a future state, we don't have a basic understanding of supply chain planning and inventory optimization to, we want to use AI.
Yes. No, it's a great area, Emily. And we actually, I mentioned we're in 30 countries and most of our customers are some of the largest manufacturers in the world. And that exact use case is things that we're actually attacking. Now, our approach has always been kind of a factory centric on up. In other words, we really understand the factory and policies and clear to build. But now supply chain is really a series of connected factories. So like there's cases where you have 4 or 5 factories and now you want to set up a 3PL that's going to now supply material from that factory, or you have one factory that's a feeder site to another. So the approach that we take is a very factory centric approach, but then how do we get these factories kind of communicating with one another? And you obviously deal with issues with different ERP systems and different item codes, but ultimately the goal is to take that one factory and have some success there, then start to connect these factories with, like, as you mentioned, a global clear to build process where I can look at one factory that's ultimately shipping that product, but how do I now communicate with these other factories that are maybe part of that process? Maybe they make a subassembly that's feeding that site. And how do I now take that clear to build and start to extend it so the entire supply chain no longer looks like these siloed factories, but it looks like one connected system. So that last image, Emily, that I was describing, where it starts at a factory level in our view, and then you start to go up and create a connected system. That's where we found you start to solve those issues. And it sounds kind of maybe obvious in a way, but well, I would say that many of these systems that exist today are very top down, right? They start with top level planning and forecasting. And then those in supply chain are like, yeah, but the forecast is wrong. What do I do? And now your spreadsheets, you're on phone calls, emails. But we take a very factory centric on up approach. And so those issues now have to be solved at the factory. And then it becomes a lot easier to solve as you start to connect that from factory to supplier and supplier to supplier, if that makes sense.
Got it. Okay. Awesome. So we have one other question from Shannon. Do customers get a standard amount of tokens to use K? What's the average number of tokens your current customers use annually?
Yeah. So with ours, I don't have the exact token number, but in terms of the way we do it, for our customers, there's a certain number of K agents that people can use. So we pretty much, we're a SaaS software company. So we look at the site, how many sites are deployed, and then based on that, there's normally a certain number of agents that are included. And then if they want to use additional agents, we just have a certain cost per agent that we'll typically do over time. But right now it's pure, it's really based on the number of sites that are deployed. And then based on that, we deploy a certain number of agents they could use. We do find that, you have kind of a certain personas that use it, like buyers and analysts tend to use it quite a bit. And then you have executives and their job is really understanding and having somebody who could help answer very specific questions around the data or help maybe make recommendations around certain actions. But then you have another persona, which is more the leadership, and they just want to ask much broader questions, but they're trying to correlate very complicated data and come up with very quick answers. That's kind of another typical use case. But to answer your question, yeah, that's kind of the way we deploy K right now. But it's also definitely an evolving area for us over the last couple of years too. You know, that industry and what it can do and how we deploy it's kind of changing quite a bit here over the last even 6 months or so.
Sure. Fabulous. Thank you very much, Richard and Lean DNA team, for reaching out to the chapter, for your interest in speaking to our chapter constituents, for taking the time today. Thank you, everybody who joined and signed up. Again, shameless plug for Summit. If you liked this and you want to learn more, check out Summit. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or the info@ascm.twincities.org. Might be the other way around, info@twincities.ascm.org. John will correct me on that, I'm sure. I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and I see many of you at Summit in a couple of weeks here. Greg, how can we access the recordings? So once the recording is, thank you, twincities.ascm.org. John, I knew you'd be there for me. Access the recordings. Keep an eye open for LinkedIn. So we will post it on the LinkedIn site that has been posted, and it will be, I believe we put them somewhere on the website, but that's going to be the best way, is to keep an eye open for it on LinkedIn. And it usually comes out within a week or so. All right. Thank you so much, Richard. Have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to being in touch with you.
Thank you, Emily. We appreciate the opportunity.
Our pleasure. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.